In this video, I want to have a look at sketching squares and square roots. So that means if we're given a function y equals f of x, then we're going to have a look at how we can sketch y equals the square root of that function and y squared equals that function. We'll look first at sketching y equals the square root. So to do that, we've got these steps here. First off, we're going to delete everything below the x-axis. The reason we're going to do that is if our function is y equals the square root of x, it is talking about the positive square root. So we can't end up with any negative y values because it hasn't got that plus minus in front. It's only talking about the positive values. So everything in our new graph is going to be above the x-axis. Next, if we've got our function equaling 0 or 1, then when we take the square root of it, it's still going to be equal to 0 or 1 because the square root of 0 is 0 and the square root of 1 is 1. If f of x, so our original function, is above 1, so anything greater than 1, then when we take the square root of it, our answer here, the value, the y value for this, is going to be smaller than whatever it was in the original function. But if our function has a y value between 0 and 1, then when we take the square root, the value that we get is actually going to be larger than the original. So it'll be above our original graph. Let's have a look at some examples. So we're going to try and sketch the square root of this function. So first off, like we said, everything under the x-axis we're going to delete. That's not going to be there. So that means that our new function, our square root function, is going to have a domain of when x is less than or equal to minus 1 or greater than or equal to 1. So it's not going to exist, our new function, in between minus 1 and 1. All right, the next thing is when f of x, so our original function, is 0, our new function is going to be the same as well. So we know it's going to be at this point and this point. Our new function is going to pass through those as well. We also know that when it's at 1, it's going to have the same value. So it's going to pass through this point and this point. Okay, the next part is when it's above 1, the square root is smaller. So that means in this section up here, where the y value or the ordinate of our original function is greater than 1, then our function, our new function, is going to be below this graph. But in this section here, where the y value is between 0 and 1, our new function, our square root function, is going to be larger than our original function, so it's going to be above the graph. So it's going to curve up like this. It's going to be above our graph, cut through this point here, and then it's going to be below the graph there. All right, so remember, this is a sketch. It doesn't have to have the exact right values. Often you might even be given a graph that doesn't have any values on it at all along here. All right, so that is a sketch of what our square root function is going to look like. Let's have a look at another example. The example is a little more complicated. We can start again by saying that our new function, when we take the square root, is not going to have, it's not going to exist above 2 because that's where our original function is negative, or between minus 1 and 0 because it's negative there as well. So we're going to ignore those parts. Then we can say whenever our function is 0, our new function is going to be 0 as well. So we know it's going to pass through these 3 points. And wherever it's 1, it's going to be equal as well. So these 3 points here. So that gives us a good starting off point, but then we need to figure out what's going to happen. Now over here, that's going to be very similar to what happened in our first function. This should also be symmetric, which is a bit hard to draw on this, but we'll try and get it as accurate as we can. Okay, so it's going to do something like that, curving off up that way. Now this bit's a bit more interesting. Between 0 and 1, like we said, we know it's going to be above our original function. Where the original has a value greater than 1, our function is going to be below it, so it's going to be underneath that curve, and then it's going to come back and be greater than it, so above it, again over here. So what we're going to end up with is something that looks, hang on, that didn't go through where I needed it to. Something that looks a little bit like this. All right, so that's having a look at square roots. Now let's have a look at what happens when we've got y squared equals f of x. Trying to sketch y squared equals f of x, we can think about if we were to solve that, we'd end up with y equals plus or minus the square root of f of x. So what that means is it's going to be the blue graph that we've already graphed over here for y equals the square root, but it's also going to be the negative version of that. So when we go through and sketch this, we're going to delete everything below the x-axis. We're going to ignore that because it's not relevant. Then we're going to sketch y equals the square root of f of x, so following these steps. And then we're going to duplicate that function, reflecting it below the x-axis. So what I'm going to do for these two examples is, for this function, it's going to be this blue bit as well as the red part that I'm going to draw. So that means that this is going to be reflected underneath. And on this side as well, it's going to reflect. And this one is going to come down here like this. And then something like that. So when we're graphing y squared equals f of x, it's both the blue and the red part. So let's have a look at what they actually look like graphed with graphing software. Got our original function, and when we sketch the square root, it comes out looking like this. And if we sketch the y squared, it comes out looking like this. Now, if I take that blue one away, you can see that the red function is that whole section, including the blue, that one that we drew. Right, if we have a look then at our second example, if we sketch the square root of that, it'll look like this. And if we sketch y squared equals our function, it would look like this here. Right, so that's having a look at square and square root functions.